Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. मेरा नाम उज़ैर यूनुस है और आज हमारे one of our most frequent guests खुर्रम हुसैन मौजूद है हमारे साथ कराची से। और खुर्रम से हमने कुछ हफ्ते पहले भी बात की थी इकोनॉमी के ऊपर क्या होने वाला है। वो अगर आपने सुनी नहीं है एपिसोड तो यू शुड लिसन टू इट to get a more detailed background in terms of all that has happened. And I figured कि खुर्रम bringing you back on was important क्योंकि इस हफ्ते IMF की डेलीगेशन आई हुई है, बातचीत चल रही है। आज वज़ीर आज़म साहब ने हमारी रिकॉर्डिंग से कुछ घंटों पहले ही टेररिज्म की एपेक्स कमेटी के अंदर हेडलाइन बन गई IMF, तो उस पर भी बात करेंगे। बट फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल वेलकम बैक एंड आई होप यू आर डूइंग वेल एज वन कैन बी।
I'm doing as well as one can be under the circumstance. Good to be back.
Yeah. So let's start with where things are, Khurram, because obviously, and we were talking about this before I hit record, people like you and I are in the thick of it in terms of following every single sentence and word and how different things are being exchanged. But a lot of the audience doesn't tune in. They probably tune in and listen to this podcast or read the news story from the weekend about what's going on. But so give us an overview of where things are. There's a big IMF delegation in Islamabad for 9 days, which is, in my view, unprecedented. And then, of course, all of the news headlines have not been reassuring in the sense that when the finance minister of a nuclear-armed nation starts talking to charitable trusts to raise $2 billion over 5 years, I don't know about you, but I get very concerned. So catch us up to speed about all that has happened in this action-packed week in Pakistan.
Okay, what's happened is that Pakistan has come, in fact, precariously close to a situation where the foreign exchange reserves genuinely run out, that the country is unable to pay for its foreign trade and imports. It's an energy-dependent country. It's dependent on imports to meet its energy requirements, and the energy supply chain shutting down is now increasingly looking like a possibility. Even about a month or so back, Uzair, we used to talk about it more as a scenario. Today, it's a live possibility. And last week, the government took some critical actions to unlock the IMF talks that had been at an impasse since September, and it floated the exchange rate, which was one of the core demands of the IMF. And as soon as that happened, the very next day, the IMF announced that they announced the dates for the mission, a forthcoming mission. And the dates, the exchange rate was floated on a Thursday. On a Friday, the mission, they announced the mission. And they said the IMF will be arriving on Monday. And that talks will begin from Tuesday onwards, which is Feb 1, and will run all the way through Feb 9, which, as you pointed out, is a very, very long mission, which clearly shows that there is a lot to talk about and to discuss. Which is why they've given so much time. So one of the core demands has been met, which is the flotation of the exchange rate, and clearly a very, very heavy agenda remains to be talked about. So on Monday, now what happened is that on Thursday, as the exchange rate was floated, by end of trade Friday, I was, for one, expecting that the dollar would more or less have found its footing, and the weekend would be spent by firms and the rest of us, sort of pricing in the new level of the US dollar against the rupee. But that didn't happen. And instead, the exchange rate continued to see volatility on Monday morning and all through Monday as well, leaving a question mark about, where is all this going? And are we really going to, at what point will the dollar find its level? The volatility began to show some signs of plateauing out on Tuesday when the discussions and the conversations began with the IMF, and there was a certain sense. I think a lot of people, myself included, allowed ourselves a little sliver of optimism that now that the fund mission is here, the government is moving to meet the requirements. That quite possibly they'll work something out, and we will not really go over the edge in the sense that right now the imports, the import supply chain is disrupted in the country, but at least essential items are still getting through. But the whole crisis takes a new shape altogether once energy imports start being hit. That, in a sense, is the third rail to be watching for. Oil marketing companies have been warning for a couple of weeks that they are having a hard time opening LC, securing and getting supplies into Pakistan. Those warnings are getting more sort of sounding with a bit more frequency than they were a few months ago, which is worrying. So nevertheless, when the talks began, it seemed that they'll find a way forward. The exchange rate began to settle somewhere on Wednesday, and I'm focusing on the exchange rate because it is a very key metric at this point in time. It's where a lot of the uncertainty prevailing in the rest of the economy is, in a sense, focused. The exchange rate has become the lightning rod for the anxieties that otherwise permeate the economy all over the place. So it's a good place to keep an eye on whether or not this ship is stabilizing and finding calm waters. And on Wednesday, we saw the first signs of that beginning to happen. So you could look at the opening, the rate at which the dollar opened and the rate at which it closed. And there wasn't a huge spread. In fact, there was a slight down. The exchange rate came down slightly by the close of trade, which was a good enough signal that, okay, maybe things are beginning to settle on that market. And then this morning, almost as if on cue, the Prime Minister's statement comes out. And it came out sort of, I first saw it late morning. I think it was late morning, early afternoon. Somewhere I was out, but somebody sent me a message and I checked. And there it was. He's saying the IMF is giving us a hard time. And once again, there was a blowout on the exchange rate. Once again, the financial markets pounced on that. They reacted to that. Maybe pounced is the wrong word. Yeah, they reacted to that, saying, "Uh-oh, maybe the talks aren't going that well after all." And maybe they will not find their way through to a staff level agreement, which is what should happen by Feb 9 when the talks conclude. There should be a formal statement from the IMF saying that we have reached a staff level agreement. And once again, the volatility broke out all over again. Maybe they'll do something. Maybe the government will take cognizance of the fact that their own statements triggered volatility in the financial markets. I understand international capital markets, Pakistani paper in international capital markets also saw renewed volatility today. Coupon rates on bonds maturing in April 2024, for example, fell one more time after they had sort of recovered from their lows in December. The rates that I saw were somewhere around 56. I believe they had touched about 62, 63, somewhere around December. And the stock market fell at the same time. So where things stand is that we are keeping a close eye on the news flow coming out of these talks. There are a handful of reporters trying their best to penetrate what are otherwise very opaque proceedings. And the tidbits that are coming out show that there is indeed a heavy agenda. For example, $600 billion worth of new revenue measures need to be announced by the government and need to be.
You mean 600 rupees, just to correct. 600.
I'm really sorry. 600 billion rupees. The exchange rate is on my mind.
Exchange rate, yeah.
But the 600 billion rupee package of new revenue measures needs to be agreed upon. And not only that the government just says, okay, we will do these things, it needs to be something that is credible and that can, between now and June, generate up to that level of fresh revenues, which means the reliance has to be placed on the most elastic revenue lines that there are. There's no room now to say, to float outlandish plans that, oh, we'll install point of sale machines and retailers and at the same time net their transactions and increase our tax base and increase our revenues. Well, that sounds like a great plan that Mr. Shaukat Tareen came up with 2 years ago, but it didn't really work in reality. They're going to need something far more realistic, and that basically means taxes on power, on fuel. It means hiking of income tax rates on salaried people and corporate income tax rates. It means super taxes and on big corporates, another slew of withholding taxes on exporters, importers, banking transactions. These are the sort of more liquid or more elastic revenue lines available to the state. And it is from these that they are going to have to find 600 billion additional rupees to satisfy the fund with. And this will have to be done in the next few days. Coupled with that, there was a circular debt reduction plan that they were supposed to announce. News coming out of the meetings is that whatever plan was placed before them, now we haven't seen the details, but whatever plan was placed before them lacked the credibility and doesn't seem to have gone
On
through.
the circular debt plan, I want to, because I heard something similar, and I think it was yesterday afternoon Eastern time, I was catching up with sort of the Mehtab Heathers and the Shahbaz Ranas of the world sort of giving us an update. And they're at least two of the few journalists you mentioned whose reporting, we all are relying on.
And Falikiani,
Falikiani
Shabazz,
and Mehtab, right? And so
people, everyone's eyes on their reporting.
One of the things they said, which, I sort of paused and sort of had to hit the pause screen literally on the interview I was watching, was this proposal that we will do the rate hikes in a staggered manner. I think it was Khurram Dastagir Khan, the minister, who was on Shahbaz Rana's show, I think, was talking about this. And then there was a conversation that came in other parts about it. And you tell me what you think about this, because when I heard the minister say this, and then I heard Shahbaz and Mehtab sort of, give their own takeaways on what's going on with the circular debt management plan, was that you have to be a bit clueless to propose this to the IMF when for the last so many months, ignore even Shaukat Tareen, just do September onwards when Dar Saab came back, the government has shown a sort of an inability to follow through on its promises when it says yes. So it signs the dotted line ke haan kar lenge, paise aa jate hain aur phir mukkar jate hain. So for a minister to propose something as I see it as preposterous, right? That we will stagger this now and then a bit in the summer and then a bit in August. So give us some time. Are they clueless? Are they lying? Are they delusional? How does a minister make that offer when he knows the background of where things have come from?
Okay, look, there are a number of failures that are operating right now at the governmental level. So one of those is, at least the impression now, this is just me sharing my impressions, right? This is not inside information or anything quite so fancy. But I'm getting the impression that that number one, they're not talking to each other in the way that they should be. The power division and the power minister ought to have been speaking to the finance minister. The two of them ought to have been speaking with the petroleum minister. The three of them ought to have been speaking with the prime minister. And each one of them should have had a very structured and a very tight mechanism to collectively pull together their respective resources, the governmental resources under their charge, and pull together a plan.
And sorry to interrupt you here, like I'll give the audience an example of what you're getting at, because in that same interview, Minister Khurram Dastagir said, well, if the finance ministry released the subsidy for power in a timely basis, there would be no circular debt. And I was like, does that even matter? If he releases the payments to you in a timely manner, it goes into the fiscal deficit bucket instead of the circular deficit bucket. In any case, it's debt that has to be taken on because you are not meeting your receivables with the amounts payable, right? And it's an example of what you're getting at.
It's exactly the kind of thing I'm getting at. And, you actually took it one step further. I would simply stop when he says that and say, okay, by the time the IMF mission has arrived in Pakistan and the crucial talks have begun, this is a conversation you should have had and sorted out with your colleague, your minister by now. You should not be sitting on the air on the second day of the parlays, sharing this with the general public. The obvious question would be, well, did you tell the finance minister this? What did he say in response? And did the two of you arrive at some kind of a solution, a way to sort of manage this and say, okay, we will release this much money, you will raise tariffs by that much, we'll know, whatever it is. By now, there ought to have been a solution to this. They should not be saying, like, in my department, everything is fine, but that guy there is not doing his job right. And as a result, it's creating problems for me. Not now, not today, not on the second day of the parlays after the mission has arrived. These issues should have been worked out. And this would happen when there is ownership at the top. That is something that I'm looking for. And repeatedly, I'm coming up against the same impression, Uzair, that the Prime Minister is not coming across to me as somebody who is really involved with the details, or never mind involved, who's even familiar with the details of the conversation that Pakistan is having with the IMF. The situation is serious enough that it requires and especially if interministerial coordination is an issue at play. That's a classic example for the Prime Minister to step in and say, okay, you tell me, what problem are you having?
And I'll flag here for the audience one more thing that, it kind of, we could have maybe given some brownie points if, let's say, one minister was from the PMLN, the other was from the PPP, the other was from the JUIF, and they don't get along, and we kind of get coalition politics. There's a whole science to it, understanding it, and we could have been giving a bit more leeway. But all of these guys are from the same party, and they've been in the same party for a long, long time. So it's not like they don't get along. They're part of the same team, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, look, ordinarily, there is absolutely no excuse for members of a government to not coordinate with each other and to show outward signs of this kind of coordination failure, this inability on their part to sort of come and gel and click together as a team and solve the problem that is there before them together. This is not up to one person alone to solve this problem. They have to learn to work together. And if they don't, I don't think we're going to get there. Otherwise, all they'll have, eventually, they'll just have to sign the dotted line and just sign whatever the IMF dictates. Because mind you, the IMF doesn't exactly dictate to countries. It doesn't say you must do this. What the IMF says is that we need to see revenues of about this much in order for you to be able to meet your primary deficit target. How do you plan to raise those revenues? And if you don't have a credible plan yourself, then they step forward and say, well, that's not working. This is how you're going to do it. And they simply invoke the most elastic lines, revenue lines. Likewise with the circular debt. They'll say, what's your circular debt reduction plan? If you don't have a credible plan to put before them, they'll simply say, well, go ahead and raise tariffs then. That's the last and simplest solution. It doesn't do the consumers any good, and it certainly eats away the government's political capital. But then the IMF says, if there's a better way, what is it? You tell us. And it's up to the government in question at that time to put something credible on the table. I don't see that happening right now. And I fear that they will, the time for half measures is gone. The time for saying, well, we'll increase this, but we'll do it in a staggered way. Increase or soften the target for us by this much. All those things have already been done. This program has been augmented, it has been softened, and it has been lengthened. It has been prolonged. That's not going to continue forever.
The other thing I wanna touch on with you. So you said taxes is the first thing. There's a circular debt management plan. That's the other. Is there anything else that's a big ticket item that's still part that needs to be hashed out? Because from my perspective, those are the two big ones. And I was wondering if there was anything else also left.
There are a couple of other big ones. I think expenditure cuts, but I think those may be last in the discussions ongoing. There's one thing in particular. When the IMF made the announcement that I'm talking about last Friday's announcement, when they said that they are sending a mission that will arrive on Monday. There's one phrase in there that they used, and it said to restore the functioning of the financial markets. I think the word restore may not have been used, but I forget the exact language, but there's something to do with to get the financial markets working again. I think this may turn out to be a bigger deal than the government may be bargaining for. I don't know to what extent they are prepared, because if you unpack this statement, what that really means is they've got to clear the backlog that is piling up on the imports side. But at the same time, they've got to unwind the forward positions that the state bank has taken, very short-term forward positions. Because that is actually, those are emergency measures, and that's the state
And they're
bank
worth
taking
what,
those.
$700 million?
The estimates I'm hearing are saying about $500-600 million. We saw Brad Setzer tweeting higher numbers earlier this morning. Frankly, the state bank hasn't really released this data since October. I haven't checked in the last few days, but it hasn't really been released. So I'm not sure where Brad is getting his figures from. But if we speak to sources within the interbank market, the figures I was getting was saying about $500-600 million worth of borrowing. These positions are going to have to be unwound, and only then will you have normal functioning financial markets. What this basically means is that as soon as you get the money, you've got to open up your import supply line. You've got to start clearing all the LCs that have already been accumulated. I don't know what the amount for those is. There are LCs waiting to be cleared the cargoes waiting clearance at the ports, and those waiting to be laden at ports of lading, and then unwinding these positions. So I think pretty much all the money, if not more than what the IMF is going to give as its first tranche, should be consumed just in this process alone.
Well, let's do the math, right? Because I was actually looking forward. You read my mind. I wanted to do this math with you. Mota mota agar kare.
Go for it. I love it when you get into the numbers.
So let's do this. 3 billion left in the official reserves. And let's assume that this is some miracle happens on Monday, where the IMF gives its billion, and then everything comes from the Qataris, UAE, Saudi, China. Let's assume Pakistan gets a whopping $10 billion on Monday, right? Let's get our hopes up.
Why? No, wait. Why are we doing that? Why 10?
I'm just saying 1 billion from there. So if it's 1 billion from, let's break it down actually. 1 billion from the IMF, right? That's the tranche coming in. That takes
no, run the numbers on 5, okay? Because 1 billion IMF, 2 billion Saudi, 1 billion UAE, and let's just say 2 billion from well-wishers, okay?
From okay, चलो 5 कर देते हैं. आपने आधा कर दिया, चले 5 पे आ जाते हैं.
10 तो ridiculous है, but 5 पे आप मुझे बताएं.
5 से करते हैं. तो 5 से अगर हम करें तो 5 में से जो है 2 billion, former finance minister says 4 billion stuck at ports. I say cut it by half. We don't know the exact number. So 2 billion is stuck. It's a bit much. So 2 billion goes out the window there. Okay, so you're back to what? From 8, you've come down to 6. Then you've got 3 billion in debt payments, according to the governor of the central bank. So that's 3 gone. So you're back at 3 essentially, which is where we are right now. There's $500 million of forward swaps that need to be unwound. So you're at 2.5. And then let's assume if Pakistan runs a current account deficit monthly on average for the next 3 months or so, 4 months at $500 million, that's 2 billion. You're at 0, basically, by June again. And so, and that 0, by the way, has 3 billion from Saudi as a deposit and 2 billion from the Chinese as a safe deposit. So you're -5 in terms of net holdings of the state bank. So even if the best case scenario materializes, you're basically broke by June 2023.
Yes. And I think that's something that had become amply clear to us at least a few months ago even, that the best case scenario that we can possibly sketch out basically takes the way the things are right now out to June. Right? It means that instead of going over the edge in February, you're looking at possibly going over the edge in June instead. To me, the conclusion here is clear, right? As soon as this program ends, there's going to be another IMF program. There's no other way for the country. But and right now, yeah, best case scenario is 5 till June.
Yeah, and just to add to this, we didn't even take into account roughly $2 billion in dividends that are supposed to be repatriated. And we are assuming import rationing, which is why $500 million in current account deficits, right? We're not saying new letters of credit will open the way they were 6 months ago. So and I remember, Khurram, you may remember this conversation when last February, before when Shaukat Tareen agreed to the new resumption of the program, we did a Twitter space and we ran through the gross external financing
Yes,
numbers.
we
You
should do
remember
that again.
that?
Yes, I do remember that. We should do it again.
This was our question at that point in time. How do you finance everything that's laid out in that February document? And the
Yes,
answer was, we
absolutely.
don't know. And now
We
here we
don't know.
are.
And here we are. And I remember in July, there was a July 2022, there was a big question mark hanging over the external financing plan. The then finance minister, Miftah Ismail, was running all over the place trying to arrange at least letters of support from bilateral creditors like Saudi, UAE, Qatar, and China, saying, trying to raise enough just in letters of support, not actual dollars, but just a letter saying, yeah, we would consider giving Pakistan $1 billion down the road. It's kind of like, a college applicant scrambling to arrange a letter of reference.
Yeah.
And you imagine a scenario where, like, somebody's been turned down by one professor. They've gone to one and that guy's turned them down, saying, no, I will not write you one. And now suddenly you're like going through your list and
You're
seeing what everybody else.
forwarding the same attachment to everybody else, changing the name and saying, "Hey, bhai, apne letterhead pe dal ke is pe dastakhat kar dein bas."
Sign kar do yaar, please. कुछ उस टाइप की सिचुएशन बनी हुई थी जुलाई अगस्त में, right? And then in August the state bank tells us, oh look, we're over financed on the current account side, the external financing needs, and why are people worried about that? But these were commitments and they were conditional on staying on a functioning IMF program, which of course the government chose not to do. The government thought that they had better ideas. They can shout things down a little bit, so they can shout at the bankers and shout at the exporters and shout at the IMF and see if they can bend reality to their will a little bit that way. These are people who seem to be used to doing things that way. Uzair, they seem to be used to getting their way by just sort of, demanding it firmly.
The other
Of
thing
course,
I
it
want to
doesn't.
get, the other thing I want to get your take on before I forget. Sorry to interrupt again. You mentioned the central bank. What do you make of their role in all of this? Because it's something that, we offline talked about this as well. And I want the audience to listen to this exchange as well, because a week before the peg broke, the governor of the central bank was again on Shahzeb Khanzada's show, saying that the market value of the rupee is what it is, 230 rupees to the dollar. Less than 48 hours after he made that statement, the peg broke. And now here we
Yes.
are. We talked about the exchange rate already. What do you make of the central bank and what the governor has done in this entire crisis?
Yeah, frankly speaking, to be very, very frank, I don't really see a central bank in Pakistan. I don't see a governor of a central bank in Pakistan. I see a monetary authority. I wouldn't call it a central bank because I imagine a central bank to be an entity that is somewhat autonomous and operates independently of governments. What we have is a monetary authority that is behaving like an attached department of the finance ministry, like the economic affairs division, or actually even that is no longer an attached department, right? But okay, that sounds harsh, I know, but I stand by it. I think the central bank has basically it lost a lot of its credibility a long time ago. It lost it when it would be hard to say when they actually had a great deal of credibility. But I think through this particular crisis, we had a new central bank governor come in. When was it? August or July? July something, right?
I think
Then
it
he
was
came in
July because he had come.
right
Yeah,
as Murtaza
he
Sayyed
came
was at.
after. Yeah, he came after Mista has resumed everything in DC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we haven't really seen a central bank operating the way an independent central bank should be. I think the monetary policy statements that they've been putting out, for example, they're just not making sense anymore. One statement they're saying inflation seems to be all right. Next time they're saying, well, it's resurging, and there's a 1 percentage point increase followed by another percentage point I don't even know what these 1 percentage point increases are supposed to do. I think given where inflation is, where it's going, given the pressures building up on the exchange rate, the time to do something drastic was back in September. And if the government had failed at that point, if the government had failed to really bring things to closure with the IMF, to announce any kind of a fiscal game plan, um, then the ball fell squarely in the state bank's court to say, well, okay, if this is the fiscal reality we are dealing with, if this is the situation with the IMF talks, then this is where your monetary policy settings need to be, um, in, um, in relation to this kind of a fiscal situation that's shaping up. But now we have it was bad enough when the state bank's analysis would be outdated within 2 months, when they would say one thing and 2 months later they would be forced to backpedal. But here we've seen it happening in 48 hours.
Yeah.
So there's not much left to say after that. If a state bank governor's analysis of the exchange rate, something which is such an important part of his portfolio of responsibilities, I'm not saying managing the exchange rate, but I'm saying at least being aware of the pressures that are bearing down on the exchange rate and building your story in accordance with those pressures. So it's a very, very central part of curating the money supply of the country. And that's its core responsibility. And if your analysis is getting disproven within 48 hours, then what's the point? What's the point of putting out any analyses after that? Seriously.
What was interesting with in the last few days where this has happened, I was listening to the Odd Lots podcast episode. I forget who it was with, but it was about the victory of team transitory inflation in the United States. And this was a fascinating conversation. But the thing that stuck to me as I was listening to it was that the person being interviewed said, we live in an era where if the Fed chair decides to fundamentally alter the structure of the US yield curve, he can do it in 60 seconds by just coming on, saying something, and the markets will react like that. Right? He was like that. And his point was communication matters a lot more in today's age of digitized markets, digitized information flows, instant connectivity than they did perhaps even 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And that made me think about this entire episode with the central bank governor and what you just said, because for you to come on primetime television, where almost when the governor is speaking, everybody who's involved in the economy and the financial markets is watching every single and listening. And for him to do this, I think it's just insanity.
Remember, I think it was in the same show where he said that next week $1 billion is about to arrive in Pakistan. I mean, putting a timeline on it. I'm trying to recall now again if it was in that show or whether it was in an analyst briefing that they do after the monetary policy.
अगले हफ्ते से पैसे आना शुरू हो जाएंगे. I remember that statement.
अगले हफ्ते से पैसे आना शुरू हो जाएंगे, right? As a central bank governor, when you put out messages like that in public and they don't come and they don't bear out, so it's not good. It's not good at all, and it becomes very hard after that to take that individual seriously as a central bank governor. Then you listen to him the way you would a joint secretary in the finance ministry, for example.
Yeah.
And I know
finance minister की तो हम ऐसे ही बात सुनते नहीं हैं, सुन के एक कान से हंस के निकाल देते हैं. But I think that's been the most disappointing part, and I want to, towards the end of this conversation, Khurram, we were chatting about this before we hit record. In terms of how you are feeling about this. And one of the reasons I bring you on to talk about this is because you've seen these cycles come and go numerous times. And the median age of Pakistan being 25, most people don't remember what has happened, right? We did the Twitter space on the Dar default in 1998 and all that he did. A lot of people just did not know, many messages saying, oh, we had no clue that this had happened. How do you feel given where Pakistan is overall in terms of, not at an analytical level, but as somebody who's seen these crises come and go, is this one more precarious, you less hopeful, more hopeful? Like what's going on in terms of you're on the ground there?
it's definitely more precarious. It's not very different in terms of its contours and in terms of how the principles are behaving, by the way. I remember in 2008, the government was not really giving off encouraging vibes as the crisis grew in nature. We had one finance minister, which was Isaac Dar initially. Then we had another, which was Naveed Qamar. And then we had a third, which was Shaukat Tareen. And that's when, a handle began to be taken on the situation. But the same story was playing out back then, in a sense. They weren't getting it. For the longest time, they just weren't getting the matters are serious. There
And
was
Hafiz
loose
Sheikh
talk.
came after Shaukat Tareen, right? If I remember.
Hafiz Sheikh came
Okay,
after Shaukat.
yeah.
Yeah. So there was loose talk going on, ministers giving odd kind of statements that leave you wondering, what the hell, what did he mean by that? Naveed Qamar just seemed lost as a finance minister. In fact, he went himself to the prime minister and said, yeah, get me out of finance. I don't like it at all. So Naveed Qamar had actually gone to the prime minister and said that I want out of the finance ministry. I can't handle this. Naveed Qamar was he came across like a very sort of a mellow, laid back, sleepy sort of a guy. And I think the pressures on the finance ministry were very intense. There was a circular debt in the power sector. There was a circular debt in the fuels sector. And there was a massive 700 billion rupee, which at that time was huge. 700 billion rupee borrowing from the state bank, an overhang that had to be wound down. Because it was proving to be incredibly inflationary. But in any case, he begged out, and then the government, I think there was a brief period when there was no finance minister, and then they actually went searching, and they found Shaukat Tareen was willing to take the position. And he came in, and then we had somebody who, for the first time, that was Shaukat Tareen's finest hour, when he took the bull by the horns and gave some pretty hardball interviews on television, breathing confidence back into the financial markets that had been shut down. But in terms of its contours, the crisis was big. There wasn't this sense of impending catastrophe the way there is today in terms of, because I think to some extent, the living example of Sri Lanka is before us. We didn't have such a living example around us. Today, we're seeing one country after another going over the edge into default. I'm reading horror stories of what happens when this sort of thing breaks out, Venezuela, Lebanon, Sri Lanka. We didn't have that in those days. There was a very, very strong relationship with the United States. A brand new government had just come in. So in many ways, it was difficult to imagine at that point in time that a country like Pakistan could fall into a severe balance of payments crisis of the sort that we are facing today. There were too many measures stopping that. But nevertheless, we were so close to the edge. The financial system had shut down. The stock markets were shut. There was a run on the banks that had begun. It hadn't yet reached the big banks, but the four small banks had pretty much run out of liquidity, and they had gone to the state banks saying that you need to now bail us out because we are hit by withdrawals that we can't honor. So it was pretty serious, but nevertheless, we didn't feel like we feel today. No matter how bad it got, we always knew that it's a matter of time before normality will return. But of course, there will be a hard road to walk before that happens. In 2013, there was, again, not a sense of impending doom, but nevertheless, a sense of an impending crisis. The power system was shutting down big time. The load shedding in Lahore, I was getting calls from people I knew saying, yeah, it's been 18 hours, no electricity. Everything is gone. UPS, generator overheated and finished. We are literally sitting here in the dark. But again, there was an interim government when this situation began to shape up, and we knew that very soon a full-time government is coming in, a government whose mandate and assumption to power is not going to be controversial. This is very important. And when they enter power, It's not in a highly contested, ferocious setting where from the get-go, they're being attacked by the opposition and whatnot. And they have the space in which to work. And they did that. And very quickly, the power system was put back up and running and whatnot. 2018 was nowhere near as serious of a crisis. At least it didn't feel that way. There were no active shortages breaking out all around us. There was no massive volatility on the exchange rate. There was a devaluation that we underwent a few months later, but everybody knew that that was coming. We were pretty short on reserves at that time, but as in terms of the macroeconomics of the situation, yes, the situation was very bad, but it had not yet broken the bounds of the macroeconomic indicators and begun to actively disrupt the day-to-day life in the way it did in 2008 and in the way it did in 2013. Today is different. Today there's that sense in the back of your mind that, look, this is bad, but it's going to be all right. That sense is not there anymore. It's not there with me, but I can also confirm that a lot of people around me are finding it hard right now to hold on to that. It's that sense that has gotten us through every such crisis, Uzair. It's that sense that got us through the power breakdown that happened last week. Okay, I mean, a 24-hour power breakdown, but somewhere in the back of your mind, that it's a matter of time. The power's going to be back by this evening. It'll be back by tomorrow morning. It'll be back in the afternoon. It's a matter of hours. It's coming. And in the meantime, you just sort of like make do. If your UPS has run out, you do something else. The problem is when that sense is not there. And that's the big problem today. That the sense that something will happen to avert this approaching crisis. Pakistan is isolated. Other countries are going over the edge. The crisis is very real. It's hitting day-to-day life by this point in time. And if these talks with the IMF don't end with a staff-level agreement, I don't know. Well, maybe we should meet again when that happens, then figure out. But I think at that point we'll be in an exceedingly serious situation. So that's one of the ways in which this is different. But in terms of its macroeconomics, I mean, is this the lowest the reserves have ever hit? Probably. But it's lower by, let's say we're at what, 3 weeks import cover. In the past, it's been about 4 weeks, right? So I mean, it's not like heaven and hell, the difference between the macroeconomics of today versus that of the past. It's just that the circumstances are such that we don't have any straws at which to clutch and sort of nurture a sense of optimism. It's very hard to do that right now.
Yeah, and I think that really, to me, is all, the most concerning thing, right? And sort of, if we were to bring this full circle to where we started this conversation with you talking about how you and I and many of us thought that the currency would stabilize at a certain level, but it didn't. The plateau wasn't there. It came and went down further. And maybe
Actually,
that
I never actually harbored any hopes or any sort of an expectation of where it will stabilize. I was very much in a wait-and-see mode.
No, yeah, but my point was that, we sort of around 270, at least I was like, okay, theek hai, yahan pe sambal jayegi abhi.
Everybody was thinking something, right? I mean, we had people who were saying 250, we had people saying 260, then there were people saying 270, people saying 275. I don't know how people were deriving these numbers.
Yeah.
But the market didn't really give us the permission otherwise to really harbor this expectation.
Yeah, and the thing I was thinking about as you're explaining this sort of lack of optimism or something to grasp at, to say that things will get better. Maybe that also explains the volatility in the currency market as well, right? People have dollarized, they have hoarded onto dollar denominated assets, and if they don't have that sense of reassurance in the back of their mind, excuse me, then perhaps it makes sense why they haven't liquidated what we would expect them to start liquidating their dollar positions. And then, of course, the communication stuff we talked about doesn't help the situation. But I think that's where this crisis, at least to me, seems different. Is
Yeah,
people are
yeah.
not are refusing to budge or change their expectations of the future simply because they don't have that sense of optimism.
I think they're waiting for a sign. They don't quite know what that sign will be, but they are waiting for some kind of a sign. I don't think people are waiting for a price and say, okay, let it hit 280 and then
Yeah,
I'll sell. But they're waiting for some kind of a sign that makes it very clear to them that, okay, now we're turning the corner.
yeah,
And the staff level agreement could be one of those signs, followed perhaps by a Saudi announcement and a UAE announcement. Because the state bank governor now telling us, oh, dollars are about to arrive. Well, I don't think anyone's going to really put any,
or they might do the reverse actually based on what he said.
yeah,
जो कह रहा है उसका उल्टा होगा तो वही करो.
उल्टा ही होता है तो अब तो और ही कुछ हो जाएगा. So yeah, but I think that's what's going on.
Yeah,
That people are waiting for some kind of a sign that they can count on, that they can rely on, and it would have to come from outside the country.
yeah.
It's not a sign that will come from within. And
Well,
let's
let's see what happens. And again, thank you for your time, for your candid thoughts on this, and again, hoping that something positive comes out from this weekend or maybe Monday, and we'll continue to see what shapes up next week. In the meantime, take care, and we'll stay in touch and keep following the situation. And for the audience, again, I'll repeat this message. If you are in Pakistan or you're abroad and you're sort of following the situation, take care of those less privileged around you. It's a tough time. It's going to get tougher. So whatever you can do to be, you have some empathy, help out. If you can't help out financially, help out in other ways, but do that because it's many of us are privileged to not be impacted by it as much as those in the lower middle end of the spectrum in terms of their income levels. But it is a difficult period and it's only going to get difficult. So that's my message to all of you, is to take care of those around you, and stay safe. And until next time, Khurram, we'll have you on soon again. Thank you.